What up, all my tech nexters? We've got a special video for you today where we are talking about forced perspective in The Lord of the Rings and the Rings of Power, or more specifically, how Peter Jackson's adaptation of The Lord of the Rings did a really good job with forced perspective, and Rings of Power, much like everything else in its execution, completely misunderstands how to use forced perspective and consequently created a garbage product. So this is a bit of a deep dive today. What is forced perspective? If you already know, just bear with me because this will be quick. And if you don't know, then also bear with me and I'll make it quick. But first, here's the theme song, everybody.
Oh, he's technically Mexican and 3/4 American, but for 3 generations he's got that nationality. Great-great-grandpa headed south, whose kids had kids then turned around. It's not what the show's about, but it's why he's Mexican technically. He hopes that he was raised in New Mexico, lived in Guadalajara for 2 years, speaks fluent Spanish with a bachelor's degree in language, and makes a mean taquito.
Now, it is no secret that I strongly dislike Amazon's The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. It was a horrible, horrible TV show, and I've covered the show at length during my weekly live stream Best Gen. But in those streams, we mostly talk about the poor narrative decisions and how to structure stories as a whole. So this video, we're going to get a little nitpicky. And yes, I acknowledge that this complaint is nitpicky, but I don't care. Amazon spent way too much money on this production to have these kinds of mistakes prevalent in the final product. And it's even more egregious when you compare it to Peter Jackson's adaptation of The Lord of the Rings, which was made like 20 years ago with a shoestring budget compared to how much money Amazon pumped into this product. And it is embarrassing because the final product was abysmal. So without further ado, what is forced perspective? You've been looking at it this whole time. This shot from The Lord of the Rings is a perfect example of what forced perspective is. You have 2 characters on screen, Gandalf the Grey and Frodo McBaggins. Now, these characters are very different sizes. Gandalf is Maya, a space wizard sent by God to guide Middle-earth into defeating Sauron, and Frodo is a wee hobbit who are like the size of midgets in the real world. The problem is these characters are played by actors who are roughly the same height. So anytime you have them on screen together, you have to use movie magic to make them look different sizes. Now, this is kind of hard to do, but movies have been doing it for a long time. What you do is you have one actor placed closer to the camera and the other actor placed farther away from the camera, and you shoot them in the same frame, and if you get the camera in the right spot, it will look like they're standing right next to each other, but they are different sizes. This shot in The Fellowship of the Ring is executed so perfectly, you literally cannot tell that that is happening. And watch, we'll play the whole thing. It looks like they are sitting right next to each other, but Gandalf is big and Frodo is small. That is not the case. What is actually going on is they are sitting in a very lopsided cart. Ian McKellen playing Gandalf is placed right in front of the camera, and Elijah Wood playing Frodo is actually pretty far away from the camera. And this cart, if you looked at it from a different angle, is wacko. You see Gandalf right here is next to a normal-sized cart post, and the post that Frodo is clinging on to is actually giant, and his seat is much further back. But it's crafted so well that you cannot see the seams. It's somewhere right here, or probably behind Gandalf's arm, where the different size seats meet up. It's crazy, but it's done so well, you can't tell what's going on. And that's how it should be. When you use forced perspective correctly, you're not supposed to be able to see the seams. And Peter Jackson executed this wonderfully throughout all 3 movies. Here's a little behind-the-scenes footage of Peter Jackson talking about how they filmed these scenes. In this, you have Peter Jackson and whoever this is looking like one is small and the other isn't, but once the camera starts moving, you can tell what's actually going on. He's just sitting really far back and his chair is big. That's it. It's not complicated. But in order to pull it off, you need people behind the camera who are competent. Now, the big drawback to using these forced perspective shots is up until this point in filmmaking, you always had to have a static camera because, as you can see in this example, once the camera moves, the magic is lost and you can see what's happening. And in the first example, you can see the camera is not moving. It's locked off and they can just have the actors talking. Now, Peter Jackson is a madman, and he didn't like this constraint. So, he created a new way to do forced perspective that is insane! By utilizing camera tracking and moving set pieces, Peter Jackson figured out a way to do forced perspective with a moving camera. And this is how they pulled that off. If you wanted to do the same trick with two people sitting at a table, but one smaller than the other, you put your camera on a rail, programmed its movements, and you put your small actor also on a rail, and mathematically calculated the small actor's movements to coincide with the camera movement. So as the camera moves in the scene, the small actor is also moving on a rail in the scene. And then, just like magic, you can get a forced perspective shot with a dynamic camera, like this. Now, this was only pulled off because you had people who were involved in this project who cared so deeply about the adaptation that they literally created new technology to be able to service the medium in a way that the fans would appreciate. And you have to commend Peter Jackson's dedication to this craft. What he pulled off with these shots was nothing short of miraculous and unheard of at the time. I mean, look at what he's capable of doing. That's so cool! And here's an example of how they used that in the movie. At the beginning of The Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf and Frodo meet inside Bag End, and you can see here, their table is chopped in half. Ian McKellen's table is built small, and Elijah Wood's table is built oversized. Then those pieces are put on tracks, and as the camera moves through the scene, the table slides back and forth, and it looks like the table is one piece. The difficult part here, aside from calculating all of the movements, is the actors aren't actually touching each other, so when they're interacting, it took a lot of takes to figure out where the actors needed to be looking so that on camera it looked like they were talking to each other. But just look at the dedication to the craft. This is mind-blowing technology. You can see the camera moving and the table moving, and the table looks like something out of Alice in Wonderland, but from the right angle, it looks perfect. This is what true filmmaking used to be. People finding creative solutions to create literal magic in camera. And when it was all put together, you got something that looked like this. You can't even tell. The seams are so perfect, it looks like they're just at a dinner table together. That is how you do forced perspective. Oh, it's so good. It's so crazy. I love it so much. Now, let's take a look at how Rings of Power handles forced perspective. And the quick answer is they don't. They straight up just don't use forced perspective because they are completely incompetent. I scoured through a lot of footage from this show searching for good examples of forced perspective, and there's literally only one. And it was in the second episode. They literally only do it once. The rest of the time, they just pretend it's forced perspective, and it ends up looking really bad and really cheap. And you can tell that these people really don't care about making good cinema. But let's start with the good example first. And when I say good example, I mean mediocre example, because it's not that great of an example. Here you have Nori, who's not a hobbit, and the stranger, who's definitely not Gandalf. Now, these two characters should basically have the same height ratios that Gandalf and Frodo have in the Lord of the Rings movies. In this scene, the stranger is doing magic, and Nori is calming him down. The one and only instance of actual forced perspective. But it's not even that good, because you can tell that it's forced perspective. You can tell that the stranger is actually closer to the camera than Nori is, because the camera focus is a little bit different on each character. As you can see here, the lines around Nori come off crisp and clean, whereas the lines around the stranger are kind of blurry. And you can really see the seam right here, where her hand almost touches the stranger's hair, and You can tell that they're not right next to each other. You can tell that her hand is way farther back because of the camera focus. Now, that being said, I'm just assuming that this is forced perspective, but it could also just be two different takes, and one is composed and enlarged on top of the other, which could also explain why the stranger's lines are so blurry. But I don't think that this is the case. I think that this is an actual case of just bad forced perspective. Look at it again. You do have some dynamic camera movement, but it's literally just pivoting up and down, so that wouldn't change any of the perspective. It's not good. It's really not good. Now, the majority of the rest of the scene just cuts to a bunch of close-ups between the two characters, so they don't have to keep doing this. But there are a couple of other shots where you see them both in the same frame. This is another one, and this is not forced perspective. You can tell because you never see the stranger's face the entire time. And that means it's a body double. It's someone standing close to her who is actually that big, but his face is turned away from the camera, so you can't tell it's not the same person. It's not forced perspective, but it is executed well, and Peter Jackson also used this technique. Half of the shots were forced perspective, and half of them were body doubles when you didn't need to see their faces. But this shot also betrays the crappiness of the first shot, because you can see the lines around both of them are equally crisp and clear. Then, when you go back to the other shot, they're different. So here, forced perspective is poorly executed, but then this other trick is done well. Here's another shot of them together. This could be forced perspective, or it could just be two takes, because the camera is static and they never interact with each other. Watch. It's just them sitting and talking. And this shot is done better than the first one. It's probably forced perspective. You have another similar shot of them talking, but when she reaches to interact with him, it cuts to close-ups. Now, there is one other shot where he actually gets up and moves around, but as you can see, you never see his face again, so this is likely a body double. One, because the camera is moving, and that shot would be hard to pull off with forced perspective, and also because you can see the ground, so this is just a body double. Now, these body double shots are done well. The problem is, they're cut with these forced perspective shots that are not done well. Also, there's a little bit of a continuity mistake here with the stranger's bathrobe. I don't really know what I don't know what that is. But that's the extent of the semi-praise that I can give Rings of Power, because for the rest of the TV show, there aren't any examples of them doing this. And rather than try and make them look like different sizes using techniques that work well, they just cheat, and the result ends up being the two characters don't look like they're two different sizes. Here's an example. I don't remember specifically what episode this is from because I took the screenshot a while ago, and I've been preparing for this video for a while. Forgive me. Now, here's a shot where the characters are standing next to each other. This Harfoot is obviously in the foreground and is supposed to be bigger, but these two characters are roughly standing close to each other. Nori is a little bit closer to the camera, so we can forgive it a little bit. She's supposed to be a little bit bigger than if they were standing equal distance from the camera. But as you can see from this picture, they're kind of the same size. He's just wearing high heels. Watch, let me pull out some wireframes. Now, these are supposed to represent the proportions of a human being, and my brother helped create these images, but they're lined up to represent where the rest of the guy's body is, and where the rest of her body is, and yes, she is smaller than him, but that's because she's smaller than him in real life, and the proportions are completely different from how they were portrayed way back here. This is an accurate portrayal of their size difference, and this is just he's standing on a hill or he's wearing high heels. Here's a more realistic diagram of how their bodies are posed, and you can tell Nori is just the size of a regular human being compared to not Gandalf. So how they filmed this scene is they probably just have not Gandalf on stilts, or they have Nori standing in a pit. This kind of filming just screams lazy, sloppy, and definitely not worth $1 billion. So in the shot, if the stranger was actually as big as he's supposed to look here, his legs would have to be super long because the rest of his body is proportionate. You can see his nipples right here and his belly button are lined up where they're supposed to be in his head. So if he was supposed to be this tall, his legs would just have to be unnaturally long and quite frankly, kind of freaky. But I guess this isn't too crazy because those are actually the exact same proportions that Barbie has. Talk about unrealistic Maya standards, am I right, guys? So this is an example of, I don't even want to call it forced perspective because that's not what it is. It's just bad filmmaking. Here's another scene that is quite egregious and significantly more difficult to see because it's so freaking dark. But you have Feminem and the Slim Ladies show up and harass the Harfoots. And this is the one scene where they're in the same shot together. And you could... I mean... It's executed so poorly. They are trying to do forced perspective here, but it's just bad because the filmmakers are incompetent. Because you can literally see the platform in the shot. You just have the band of sisters standing higher and closer to camera, and the Harfoots walking in a trench. Look at it go. It's really bad. Here's a still, and in the shot, you can see that this character is standing about where this character is standing in regards to distance from the camera. So if we break out our little wireframes again, they're the same size. Literally the only reason that he looks smaller in this shot is because he's crouching. And if you go back and watch, all of the Harfoots are just hunched over and crouching. That is their solution to making them look like they're a different size. Just bend over, guys. We're too lazy to figure out how forced perspective works. And then in the penultimate episode, the stranger has a tearful goodbye as he leaves the Harfoots to do something. It's not really made clear at all in the show. But in this shot, their heads are finally... the same distance from each other as they should be if they were standing erect. But they were so lazy, instead of using forced perspective, they just chopped off the bottom of the frame. Because if we break out our wireframes, this is how they would have to look. Now, this one might not be lined up as well as the other one, but I tried to do a good job. The problem is there's only so much room down here. But you've got his head and his chest are lined up, and his hands are lined up. I have the hand going a little bit lower because it looks like his hand is bent a little bit. And here's where his feet should be on the ground. So if they're standing on an even playing field, this is how big Nori should appear, which is obviously not the case. This is where her head should be, and I've been generous. But her butt should be on her elbow, and you can tell that this is not the case. If you go back without the wireframes, her feet would just be way down below where I am. And rather than using clever filmmaking, they said, hey, we can cheat the shot by just not having their bodies in frame. Now, that's fine, but at least try. Just have her stand further away from the camera. And problem would be solved. You could still cut off their feet, and it would look better. But that's all I have for you today. Just another example of extremely lazy filmmaking from these incompetent showrunners who literally couldn't care less about the source material and what they are showing us on screen. It is an abomination, and I'm really curious as to where all of the money went, because it certainly didn't go into hiring competent people behind the camera. So to wash it down, let's go back to the Fellowship of the Ring and watch this great shot where forced perspective is actually used and done well. It's like a breath of fresh air. I hate Rings of Power so much. Thanks for bearing with me through this thorough explanation, And I am working on the final meme edit for episode 8, which is taking a while, but I hope to drop that video Monday morning. But you can get a sneak peek at the final meme edit video if you tune in on Sunday evening for our live stream Best Gen. The intro video will have a sneak peek of a couple of minutes of that final meme edit. So thanks for sticking around, and we'll see you on Monday or Sunday. Tune into the live stream. It's really good. It's a lot of fun, and I like it a lot. I like it a lot. So bye.